Hi, everyone. Welcome to the event today. We're so glad that you're here with us, and I'm excited to hear from some amazing women over the next hour, COFEM members and feminists I'm proud and happy to call my colleagues and friends. My name is Lauren Messina. I'm COFEM's coordinator. For those of you who are unfamiliar with COFEM, we are the Coalition of Feminists for Social Change. We're an advocacy collective of feminists working on ending violence against women and girls in humanitarian and development settings worldwide. Right now, we're a network of around 250 members who come from all regions of the world. And we come together really for two main purposes. One, to find solidarity, support from one another, to share challenges and really learn from one another. And two, to create a kind of collective advocacy voice to ensure that feminist informed approaches to ending violence against women and girls is incorporated into all work to do so worldwide. So if you'd like more information on COFEM, you can visit our website where you can read more about our advocacy objectives, as well as learn a little bit more or submit a form to become a member if that's something of interest to you. So today, we'll be speaking about feminist identity and activism, specifically in the humanitarian and development space. So really what it means to identify as a young feminist and be situated between two pretty strong generations, the generation that came before us, who is still fighting for justice and an end to violence against women and girls everywhere, and the strong social justice movement coming up behind us as well. So while this is a conversation among feminists who identify as part of the same generation, this is really just part of and the beginning of conversations and discussions among COFEM members who really represent a breadth of age, experience, history, background, and intergenerational exchange around activism and inhabiting feminist spaces is super important to us and really part and parcel of what COFEM is. So we are all young feminists, but we're also recognizing that we're in a transitional phase as well. So I'll let our fabulous panelists introduce themselves, and we'll go ahead and kick off the discussion. So please feel free at any time to drop any message in the chat, in the Q&A section. We'll have a portion of this call dedicated to that at the end. So I will start with my friend and panelist, Z. Suleiman.
Hi everyone, I'm Z. I identify as Nigerian American and as a social justice advocate, feminist, and Pan-Africanist. I do research on sexual and reproductive health, specifically on period poverty and maternal health. I am also COFEM's research and communications consultant, and I am really passionate about health equity, reproductive and gender justice, and access to knowledge, information, and services to produce sustainable communities.
Great, thanks, Z. Next, Alejandra Soto Ramirez.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alejandra Soto. I'm from Mexico, but right now I'm based in Bogota, Colombia. I consider myself to be a feminist activist, Latin American feminist activist. I work as a peace observer for the Swedish Fellowship for Reconciliation here in Bogota. And I also very interested in gender-based violence in the digital sphere and also in human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thanks. Next, Sharanya Sekaram.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sharanya. I identify as a feminist, a South Asian intersectional feminist activist based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. I also identify as a writer and a researcher, and I work as an independent consultant in the gender space, including with COFEM as COFEM's advocacy consultant. I think as a couple of people have said before me, I'm really passionate about the democratization of information and resources, but also access to networks and spaces. And it's such a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Sharanya and Ale. And last but not least, Catherine Nyambura.
Hi, everybody. My name is Catherine Nyambura. I'm calling in from Kenya. I self-identify as a Pan-African pluralistic feminist. I'm a consultant on global health, human rights, women's rights. And I'm excited about young feminist organizing. I currently affiliate with COFEM as a regional activities working group chair. I'm also a member of the Athena network and excited to be a core team member there and really looking forward to these dynamic discussions. I've worked on SRHR, HIV, amongst many other topics, and I look forward to a dynamic discussion today. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Catherine. All right, well, we are going to discuss a few different topics today that we've all identified as important to us and important to feminist activism now, but I really wanted to start by kind of framing this with positionality and identity, right? So this is going to frame the rest of this discussion. So as self-identified young feminists under 35, how do you all see or position yourselves generationally when you consider the younger feminists emerging? I guess just how do you identify and how do you see yourself within this long running movement? And I think I'll start by asking Catherine to answer.
So I get to go first. As a young feminist and as a younger feminist now, I think the dichotomy of young versus old for me is something I refuse to identify with. I think we are always evolving. And so I do think it's important for us to recognize the way in which our lives evolve, in which our experiences evolve, but also the ways in which we identify. I don't think age is always the most preceding identifier for me as a Black woman, because there are much more predominant things that I have to worry about in a capitalistic patriarchal world. Being Black, having to suffer structural inequality and many others. But I do think that I recognize the privilege of having had exposure to feminist organizing for a much longer time. So in my early 30s, I've been around for around 10 years. And so it means that I probably should offer more solidarity, more support to younger feminists, and also have to acknowledge that the offering support doesn't always mean that you know better. You probably are also learning much more the ways in which the world is evolving. And I would imagine that younger feminists have a better grasp at digital organizing than we are, for example, having lived and organized through and during COVID times and COVID-19 times, and also having worked in a Pan-African feminist network where the constituency was much older. I think you get to realize that age is positionality and it's very transient. I think transient is a word. And so I think it's important for us to be mindful, to not be grounded in absolute definitions, because age is not absolute. Neither are other identifiers like expertise, for example. And so I think for me, I'm mindful of the complexities in which we live our lives, and I would want to have that discussion in that way, but also being mindful of the privilege that I hold, having been exposed and having been had the tools to do some of this work for a longer time, maybe the networks, the access, the resources, and just the skill set of having probably written much more, networked much more, and things like that. So, Clara, thank you. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I really love that idea that, age isn't something that we identify as young or old, we're evolving. And I think that's really interesting and something that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Lauren, I can jump in here. And I think it's great to pick up exactly where Catherine left off, which is where she talked about age not being absolute, which I absolutely agree with, but also connecting that to the privilege of experience, which is also a privilege and does come up, the privilege of being able to have engaged. And that's not always relative to age, right? You could have entered activist or development sector spaces when you're older in the biological sense, but the exposure and the time you've had and been able to engage in these issues and these places have been less than someone who is younger biologically, but is sort of older in the sense of their experience and in the sense of the kind of networks they've built and the work they've been able to do and engage in. I also want to say that, there is this interesting moment for me personally that I had about a year ago when, I was running around being like, I'm a young feminist. And I had a 17-year-old intern at an exit interview for an organization I co-founded, said, it's amazing. So one of the things she talked about was solidarity. She said, it's amazing to have support of older women like you. I had like a heart drop moment where I was like, wow, that. But then I also really, that caused me to self-reflect in terms of the generations. And I think sometimes as millennial feminists, we forget that there is a younger and emerging generation coming after us. And while we are still looking to the older generation to learn from them and learn their histories and understand we stand on their shoulders, we also need to think about who we are preparing our shoulders for. Who's going to come stand on our shoulders? And that is these young feminists who are looking at us, who are looking to us for support, who are joining organizations that we are building, who are joining movements that we are creating, engaging with issues that we are maybe raising. And I think Catherine said it so spot on, is that they also bring a skill set to the table that we may not fully understand. Just as our grandmother's generation went Instagram and Twitter, and are you really like doing activism on that? we sometimes unconsciously are doing the same thing with things like TikTok and being like, isn't TikTok like for kids who want to dance? Is it really a space of political discourse? Well, actually, yeah, it is. We are just, I think it's really important also in that moment to self-reflect of, just as we think about the generations that have come before us and are still fighting for us, is going to come after us, and who do we prepare our shoulders for, I think is a really important reflection we need to have as we move into this sort of in-between stage of being not young in that definition, but not quite the generations that far ahead either.
Well, I think I can go ahead. Because of my age, I feel like I'm in sort of a transition phase. I'm 32 years old. And I think for me, it's a bit difficult to position myself. For instance, as Sharanya and Catherine were mentioning, we are feminist millennials or millennial feminists. And for years, we talk about this generation or newer trends or new forms of activism in the social justice sphere. But now we're seeing the emergence of Gen Z feminist activism, along with all these different skill sets and tools and new strategies supported by technology and by the rise of social media, as Sharani was mentioning. Well, I can use Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, but I don't know how to use TikTok, but you know, it's happening now. Activism is happening there. And in this sense, I can see how different it was for me back when I was a teenager or a young adult in my 20s. For me, it wasn't as easy to communicate with other feminists all around the world because we were only having, like, for example, blog sites with feminist debates or Facebook pages, but it wasn't that easy for me to communicate, for example, with feminists from Argentina. Or from other parts of Latin America. And definitely I didn't have the right connections or the right networks to begin the activism as young as I wanted to do it. And but now for us, it's really easy. For the new generation, it's really easy with just one click. We know what's happening all over the world. And I think this is really interesting. And yeah, definitely, as Sharania was mentioning, I think we need to support the new generation. And rather than say, oh, well, you're young or you're younger, you don't know how to do activism or you don't know how to bring something to the table, let's make a shift and say, okay, so how can we cooperate? How can we use our different knowledge and our different experience to create something bigger and better? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what my other co-panelists have said. And I think that Catherine raised a really important point around, I think I personally like to think of different types of feminism. So Audre Lorde said there are feminisms. And so I think that for me, it goes beyond like the difference in age. I think that what's most important for me is my skin tone, my color. But I think that in thinking of the different types of feminisms that people might ascribe to, especially like generationally, I think that for me in Nigeria, specifically with the work that I do, I've definitely seen, and I think everyone else has made this really important point about social media. And in Nigeria, there's definitely been a lot of backlash around what it means to be a feminist, right? To share tweets and say, I'm a feminist or I'm a feminist man eater. And what does that mean, right? And we definitely see a lot of Gen Zers subscribing to a lot of that. And I think that for me, and I think I find myself really in the middle, even age-wise, right? Because I'm under 30. And I think just finding myself in that middle point and working with people through the organization that I founded last year called Olishe, I trying to kind of co-dream what does feminism mean for what does feminism mean or feminisms mean for the generation that's coming behind me, and what has that meant for generations before me. I find myself more in tune with the generation that I would say is coming after me, more so than the ones before me, because I've often felt that those spaces weren't very accessible to me, mainly because I am younger. And so I've been able to connect more with some of the younger folks. And like, I guess age is a concept, right? But I think that people have different experiences. So yeah, I definitely agree with what everyone else has said, but I think that co-dreaming about and discovering what feminism feels like and what it feels like for the future and the changing like world landscape is also really important.
Thanks, E. That's a great point. And I think it really leads us well into the next question I have for all of you, which is, do you see or experience tensions within the feminist movement that you're in between, both the generation before and the generation that's coming behind? Or do you see yourself more as a bridge between these two periods?
I'm happy to go on this one, Lauren, and then pass the ball to Catherine, because I know she has some really valuable experiences there as well. I have to say that in the early days, as I discovered my feminism, it wasn't always spaces, and I relate so strongly to what you said, Z, is that I didn't always relate to the generation above me, because I was younger, because I felt like I had to prove myself before I was accepted in certain spaces, and I had to build certain credibilities, and I had to work a certain way and be a certain way, and I wasn't allowed the room always for mistakes or to be problematic, and be allowed to sort of learn, right? Because a lot of it is your unlearning, and there are things you may have no idea about until you get the chance to have someone tell you, hey, actually, why don't you think about it this way, or this is why it's problematic. And I see that now also from my generation towards the younger feminists, which is a lot of like, you're so problematic, or like, haven't you read X, Y, and Z? Well, no, because nobody has ever told me about this before, and I think something that's a great response that I see also from women of my generation who have faced this as they've found feminisms and as they started moving into this space is they are now pushing to create those spaces themselves. To welcome in and bridge gaps between and reach out to younger feminists and create spaces where they can learn in a safe way, they can learn in a supportive way, and understand that some of these conversations, some of these topics are so layered and they're so complex, and it takes time to understand how layered and complex they are. And I think what is always heartening for me to see is that how, despite all of, you have all of the tensions, you'll always find people reaching out across generations. You'll always find people trying to change things and trying to create the spaces that they maybe didn't have and that they needed, but they didn't have, and they are able to create and now are creating those. And I think that's really special and phenomenal to see. And I think nothing changes for me fundamentally like somebody younger than you reaching out and saying, I read more about this because you corrected me, or I used to hold this really, awful opinion before, and now, because you shared information openly with me, I was able to rethink where that came from. And isn't that what we really want, right? At the end of it all, is for more people to engage with this space in the ways that they need to be engaged. But yeah, I'm really keen to hear what Catherine would add to this as well.
Yeah, so I think for me, I do see the point about bridging, and I think that's a bit of a responsibility. It's quite a lot of responsibility to just even hold. However, I think for most of us, the experience that Charanya is describing is quite accurate. That before you find your way, and Z as well, before you find your way, you kind of just find a lot of divergence. For example, I do think that some of the issues that bring tensions is the issue difference in terms of how you articulate things. So I remember when I was a really young feminist in my early 20s, I was attending a meeting during the Beijing Plus 20 review, which is around 5 years ago, right? And I was surprised to see the divergent conversations around SRHR amongst the older feminists and the younger feminists. But also, I think beyond the issue disagreement, right? I think there is lack of consensus as to what are the compelling issues for feminist organizing during our time. Young feminists do think it's climate change, and they are pushing around bodily autonomy and SRHR and LGBT rights. And older feminists will be like, oh, but you've forgotten the economic justice agenda. And I think there's all these tensions around agenda setting and around content and around framing and around narrative building. And that's just one of it. I think the other issue is the dichotomies of assuming that if you're younger or if you're young, then there's only older or beyond, right? The ways in which people live their lives is if you're in your 30s, there are also the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And I do think that continuum is not normally nurtured in terms of evolving across generations. So I think we shouldn't be thinking of intergenerational, but rather multi-generations, because we have multi-generations living and coexisting at the same times. We are all experiencing COVID, but there are people who have experienced structural adjustments during World Bank and many other things like those. They have seen the neoliberalism and how the roots of it were structured in the world, how capitalism has morphed into different shapes and forms, and how we are living our lives now and the capitalism of today. And so I think right now, what I think the tensions are issue-based, but also the ways in which we dichotomize everything. It's either you're old or you're young, but you could be middle-aged too, right? Why there's no plus or minus. And so I think the bridge is there for sure. And I think the concept of mentorship sometimes comes with power connotations, where the assumption is if you're younger, you have better knowledge or you have a better understanding. But I do think that younger people will probably have a better understanding of how to organize during a pandemic than older feminists, for sure. That's something that they will mentor us into, understanding how you organize rallies and create a buzz around using, I don't think it's just TikTok, because we sometimes tend to associate a generation with something very specific, because that's how we want to have this very stark, very stiff, rigid identity politics. And I do think we never allow people to live in their multiplicity of being young people who are scholars, who are researchers, who are dynamic, who are many other things, just beyond just being feminist. And I think personally, it took me a long time before I claimed the title expert, and I am an expert, but I didn't feel that I could say that in my early 30s, because the assumption is if you're an expert, you probably have done this, I don't know, over 15 years. And so I think we also have to think of how these tensions are not just within the feminist movement, but they're inherited in terms of the structures and the hierarchies of patriarchal world, and then the additional layers of the complexity of articulating issues in a patriarchal, capitalist, neoliberal world. So we end up having to choose just one issue. We know we don't live single issue lives, but then because donors are funding SRHR, we minimize our feminist organizing to just your SRHR politics, when we do have many other things to be organizing around. So I think for me, the bridge is there, but the bridge needs to come in so many ways. It's happening. I think there are places, I'm part of the Athena network. I do feel like I have a space where I'm interacting with much younger feminists, older feminists, women who have built spaces for a longer time, who have the experience of working across different issues. And we rarely really, I don't think we have had the luxury of articulating what that multiplicity looks like, because we rarely have time to document our narratives, do we? And so the story that we have really lives with us. We don't have it written anywhere, and we don't have references for it. So I know I didn't answer it very coherently, but I think that it helps for us to start diagnosing what the root causes of these tensions are. And if we understand that, then we'll have a better sense of how to bridge the gaps and be better at providing solidarity and offering support to other people.
Thanks, Catherine. That's really powerful, and something that I'm reflecting on as well was something shared in the chat with us. And just a reminder, please send over any questions in the Q&A. This way all the participants can see them. They might want to reflect on them as well, but really, that, an attendee shared that they suspect many women who are, older, maybe have felt out that they've missed their opportunity to be a feminist or be more active in spaces or advocate for women's rights. And how can we make sure that people can get involved who are older as well, or maybe people who feel like they missed that opportunity, because it is amazing to have so many people of all generations being activists for gender equality. And we're going to shift gears a little bit, because we want to talk a little bit about gender-based violence in particular, and this kind of advocacy as COFEM members, something that you're all super familiar with. So I wanted to ask, what are some specific forms of GBV, from where you're sitting? They can get lost when we talk about GBV on a global scale that may emerge more regionally or may emerge more within, certain generations than others. I'd love to hear what you all think.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that there are multiple forms that I'll mention, but I'll start from West Africa, because that is where I'm from. And so I think that one of the things that, I think has gotten attention in the last decade or so, but kind of gets left out because it is very focused to West Africa, or that's where we see the highest number of cases, FGM and child marriage. And I think that with that, definitely what I found is very interesting is that because it's an issue that specifically affects girls, it often gets left out, because when we think about GBV, we think about violence against women specifically. And yes, we do use that term, violence against women and girls, but I think that because it's an issue so specific to the West African region that sometimes it gets left out. And I think that's why days like Day of the Girl were created, to kind of highlight some of the challenges that young girls face. But I do want to talk about period poverty and menstrual justice issues, because I think that we don't think of that as a form of gender-based violence. But at ODH specifically, we do think about it as a form of gender-based violence, because specifically period poverty is the inability to access knowledge, facilities, products, and facilities and products and information, and that's the result of systematic ignorance towards needs of women and girls that menstruate. And I think that that's one thing that we advocate for, because that is a form of violence, be it indirect, that affects girls, women and girls that menstruate specifically, and keeps them out of school. I think the other thing is forced coerced sterilization. Specifically, we see that happening in other regions on the continent, like in Namibia, of HIV positive women. But in the United States, and I'll speak of this because I do work on maternal justice in the US. We definitely have seen that. I think that last year there was that article that came out of the whistleblower at a for-profit ICE detention center, and how there's been forced sterilization procedures on immigrant women. And that is a form of gender-based violence. That's violence happening to women, specifically women that can reproduce, because, and also tied to that, and I know that we're gonna talk about intersectionality in a bit, but I think that that's where we also see intersectionality come in, right? We see the intertwining of color, of immigration status, mingling with gender, right? And we know that sterilization has, forced sterilization specifically has origins in eugenics. And so we see all of those different things coming together and resulting in forced sterilization specifically. And I think the other thing that's related to all of this that I want to mention is obstetric violence, and which is a systemic and institutionalized violence that occurs when women are denied access to quality healthcare, treated inhumanely, or forced into procedures during pregnancy, childbirth, or postpartum. And that also is a form of gender-based violence. And I think that because these are some of the issues that I've mentioned are issues that specifically affect Black women or Indigenous women, I think it also often gets left out in regional conversations. And I think that as we kind of are working towards, I don't want to say revamping, but thinking about what our priorities are for ending gender-based violence, I think that some of these things, especially period poverty and forced sterilization and obstetric violence, especially as we know there are high maternal mortality rates, specifically in countries like Nigeria and countries like the US. And so we see race and gender kind of playing a factor. So I'll pass over to Ali to kind of share any others that she might have from her region.
Yes, thank you so much, C. Well, I'm going to talk about first, not a specific form of gender-based violence here in Latin America, but a trend that we're seeing due to the pandemic and COVID-19. We're noticing that many countries are now giving gender-based violence and violence against women and girls more attention and have allocated more resources towards addressing this violence. But we activists and women's rights organizations fear that this is going to be a temporary tendency and that it won't be sustained in the longer term. And this is why we are demanding states to adopt longer term solutions and to give gender-based violence that attention that it needs. This is, there are many politicians and leaders underestimating gender-based violence or saying that, oh, it's because of the lockdown measures or because of the social distance measures that now we're seeing a rise or a spike in femicides or physical violence or domestic violence. But we want to say, no, this is due to patriarchy, this is due to machismo, and this is due to gender inequality. And ironically, it's not ironic, but it's what's happening, that due to COVID-19, a lot of state institutions all over the region are reducing their capacity, and they're leaving a lot of women and victims without solutions and protections, particularly women from rural communities or from more isolated communities, or with less access to resources. So at the same time, gender-based violence has become more visible, but at the same time, in the real world, we're not seeing better solutions, and we're not protecting women and girls. And for example, in Mexico, we've seen Despite a lot of protests and calls from civil society, our leaders and politicians, even the president has implied in his statements that machismo and gender-based violence is not that severe. And even feminist protest has been criminalized during the International Women's Day. So I think this is very serious, and I think this calls us to do more reflection and to say what's going on, what has become of the feminist movement now that even our president is demonizing the feminist protests. And the other specific form of violence that I think we can see all over the world, but that I've seen in my experience as well, is that the spike in digital violence or cyberviolence. And this is a type of form of violence that is usually underestimated and not seen as real because it doesn't happen in the physical or online space or offline space. But now with the lockdown and social distance measures, we're moving towards a virtual world. Now we're working from home. We're doing a lot of Zoom meetings, Skype calls, and so on. And we're also seeing an emergence in digital violence, such as sexual harassment, threats, cyberbullying, and so on. And this is not something new, but I think we need to take into account this and we need to give it the attention that it deserves because younger women and teenagers are usually the ones that are most affected by it. And this is even worse when you take other forms of oppression, such as race, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks both. And Sharanya and Catherine, I'm wondering if, considering the ongoing pandemic, if you see anything else that you'd like to add to this part of the conversation.
I can, oh, sorry. This person, Sharanya. No, I think it's just to agree with the points put forward by Zia and Ale. I think some of the things that I personally think needs more attention and we need to probably focus on as feminists organizing around GBV is that we have focused with this shadow pandemic narrative, we have tended to focus much more on intimate partner violence and individual violence, not structural violence. Patriarchy, capitalism in itself a very violent system. We have seen how just being Black, just being a woman, within a night or within a day, your trajectory can change because of COVID, right? In terms of economic violence and all of these things. So we haven't also given enough attention to militarization and police brutality as a result of the pandemic, and how some of the containment measures in itself were resultant, they had direct impact and had a direct effect of GBV on women. And so I think we haven't done that enough, and we need to be articulating how state responses have been militarization, which has been normalizing in itself GBV of some sort, right? Curfews across the world have meant that women who are working and who are going home has been at risk of rape, have been at risk of exposure to violence and different levels of structural violence. So I think we haven't really focused on structural violence as depending also in addition to what Ale has said, that we haven't really given that much attention, which we should have. And I think we should really be focused and keen to not denigrate our feminist analysis to just individual violence, because we still have to keep understanding the meta levels of how violence starts from the individual to the state or to even across society, because capitalism, patriarchy, neoliberalism are what enables different forms of violence. And then that means that we are accepting that homophobia is normal, or classism is normal, or ableism is normal, or post-sterilization, as we has put it, is normal. So I think for me, that's something I would want for us to focus on, and that has really been on the unprecedented rise. We have seen countries introduce much more homophobic and transphobic laws because there was not so much oversight or attention on activism during COVID-19. And also we've seen a lot of much more crackdown on civic space during pandemic. And that means that women human rights defenders have been affected by GBV as a result of those actions. So I think it will be great for us to elevate our level of analysis, and beyond problematizing GBV at the individual level, also problematize structural GBV, because that continues and that's a driver for much for the individual forms of GBV. So I know I think it's great for us to do that. And over to you, Sharanya, so you can help us articulate that more.
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to add that we're also seeing, in countries like Bangladesh and particularly in South Asia, we're seeing a huge spike in child marriage because girls are less able to access schools, and it's now seen as like, if you can't educate them, then what's the point? Get them married. FGM is seeing an absolute spike and increase. Particularly in Bangladesh and India, acid attacks, which is a very specific form of violence against women, where acid is thrown onto women to disfigure them, usually by disgruntled ex-partners, is seeing a massive spike as well. So I think these are also, it's, as Catherine said, it's important for us to talk about certain kinds of violence in the context in which they happen. And, really look at these specific outcomes.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Sharon. I know that's really affecting and something that so many people are experiencing. So thanks for giving a voice to that. And, on this note, I wanted to, shift a little bit. I mean, it's something that we've been talking as a through thread this entire time, but I think to give a bit more attention to and focus to is, how does an intersectionality framework play into your activism? So we know that we always talk about how the concept of intersectionality can be co-opted. It's an accountability tool, not a goal. The goals are justice, equity, and opportunity. But how do we think of intersectionality in the global advocacy space as activists and advocates? And how does this, change for all of you based on your location? So for instance, Sharanya, how does this emerge in the South Asian region as opposed to other regions looking at caste and class, et cetera? And for the rest of you, how is this playing out in your areas as well?
I'm happy to go first, Lauren. I think, particularly in South Asia, caste, class, I mean, of course, ethnicity and race. I'm from Sri Lanka, where the civil conflict has played such a strong role. Tensions between different races and ethnicities have absolutely always colored our history. But I think a huge thing in South Asia that's particularly important that doesn't always emerge in the rest of the world in the same way is caste. Particularly in India, caste violence and caste violence against women is brutal in the most unbelievable way possible. And, when you talk about intersectionality, this is why, so often in India, I was on a panel, just this week, where somebody said, if you're talking about rape in India, why is it necessary to mention the caste of the victim? Aren't we all women? Well, yes, of course, we're all women, but by not mentioning these specific identities we hold, which is often what triggers the violence, right? So in India, Dalit girls and women are raped because they are women. That's why rape happens, but the violence happens because they push caste boundaries in some way. Just one example is the case of these two young women who were lynched and raped by the factory owner of the factory they worked in because they dared to ask him for an increase of 3 rupees an hour to their fee. So he was appalled as an upper caste man that these low caste women dared push the boundaries of what they had been allowed or given. And that's why you talk about intersectionality, because systems of oppression don't exist in silos. They interlink with each other. They support each other. They hold each other up. And when women who hold specific further oppressed identities face violence, they face violence at the intersection of those oppressions. They're not facing violence just because they're women. They're facing violence because they are Dalit women, or because they are Black women, or because they are transgender women, or because they are queer women, or because they are women living in poverty. That is why they are facing that form of violence. And by removing or taking off those intersections of identity, we are erasing the identities that they hold that are the cause of the violence. And you can't solve one system of oppression by ignoring the others. That's never going to happen.
Thank you, Sharanya. Okay, so I think I don't know how to explain this, but when we talk about intersectionality now in our global advocacy space, I don't know, I feel like I'm thinking about how COVID and the pandemic has hit a lot of women's movements here and civil rights movements. And first, we need to take into account, we were talking about the newer generations, for example, that have more access to technology and more access to social media spaces and so on. But also, we're not talking about, there's a huge percentage of the population all over the world, but also in Latin America, for example, that they don't have access to these resources. They don't have access to a mobile phone. They don't have access to a laptop. They don't even have internet access. There are so many communities here that they don't even have electricity or water. And we were talking about the different generations. And for example, here I've seen in Colombia that the older generation or feminists with more experience have been really affected because they don't, it's not that they don't know how to connect online, but the work that they do and the fight that they do it on person, so to say. They do it by organizing themselves, going to physical spaces. And Catherine was talking about how militarization and police brutality has a spiked as well. And women human rights defenders here have been affected by that because now they cannot do their work. They cannot do their defense work. And I think when we talk about intersectionality, we need to take into account this. We need to think about these people that it's not as easy to access to all of these resources. And also I was thinking about language is a barrier, and we see how colonial languages are more important, English, French, and even Spanish. And I recognize my privilege because I speak Spanish and English. But at the same time, what about women from indigenous communities or who are not bilingual? How are we gonna integrate them to this global feminist movement? And I think we need to do more work on that, and we need to create these bridges not only between generations but also between different communities and with different taking into account these different forms of oppression. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali and Sharanya. And Z and Catherine, I know that you both have a lot of reflections on this, but I also wanted to ask as well, how does anti-Blackness and race play a role in advocacy and activism within the international development field as well?
Yeah, I think that anti-Blackness is deeply rooted in the underpinnings of the international development sector. I think it's really important to just say that up front. We know that anti-Blackness is present in how development organizations operate, who runs them, where they're even located, who sets the agenda, whose views, histories, and knowledge and experiences are validated and taken seriously. And so I think that's the first thing that we need to start from, right? And I think that these conversations around anti-Blackness and racism within even just the global landscape, right? They started through Black activism, right? So I think that there's one end of the advocacy that international development organizations working in countries where there are Black people. But I also think that it's important to recognize with activism specifically that Black activism, specifically Black women's activism, prompted these deep reflections that we see on issues of race and racism and anti-Blackness. And so I think it plays a huge part, but I think that I want to speak about what needs to be done. And so I think that international development, organizations within the international development field should really align with and support Black activism and movements internally, because I think that is the way that they can address it externally in the work that they do and also drive anti-racism and anti-Blackness in the outside world. I think the other part of that, especially when we're thinking about intersectionality, is the fact that intersectionality, as Lauren said earlier, it's not a checkbox, it's an accountability tool, right? And so how are we looking at the systems that intertwine and result in the oppression of Black women specifically? And we know that the term was coined specifically to describe the misogynor, I can never say that word properly, that Black women experience. And so I think that even in, 2018, there was research that came out and said that only 0.6% of philanthropic funds were granted to Black women's led organizations, right? So that's a problem, right? Especially if we're thinking about how a lot of these INGOs tend to get a lot of money. And I guess you can't say this is a calling out, but I think that in wanting to be not be anti-Black, right, and be anti-racist, I think it's important to speak the truth and to speak where there's problems and where the problems lie. I think that Black women specifically have the power to radicalize local communities, and they are at the forefront of movements for racial, gender, and class issues worldwide. And so that's not just in the US, that's also on the continent, that's also in the Caribbean, right? And I think that one thing that I personally like to think of is that when Black women are free, everyone else can be free because they live at the margins of all forms of oppression. So that's something that's really important for, I guess, the development field to think about, because I think that we know that a lot of development work happens on the continent, and the majority, a large population of the world is Black. And so thinking through the way those different pieces intertwine is really important. And I'll pass over to Catherine to add any other pieces that she wants to include.
So thank you so much. I think for me, this is a very personal issue, particularly as as an African woman who every time has to go to the UN, has to think of the stress of getting a visa and the possibility of denial, and how international development in itself is very inaccessible to Black women, and particularly women who are from the global South, right? And so I think international development is rooted in white supremacy. For sure, we must acknowledge that. And everybody who's part of it must acknowledge that and be part of deconstructing it. For example, for most African women, you are foregrounded in victimhood if you're in international development rooms. The assumption is if you're a speaker on a panel, you're speaking about your experience as a survivor of GBV or as a person who has experienced child early forced marriage. If you're on a panel, the assumption is you're bringing the human story, right? And so the human story means you will have to relieve your suffering in front of masses of humans, right? And if you're not seen as aligning to that, and if you're seen as difficult, then the structures of inaccessibility are reinforced for you, and then your growth is curtailed, and that's very intentional and very deliberate from some gatekeepers. So I think we must confront the ways in which hierarchies of international development work against Black women, particularly younger Black women, because in addition to the international development architecture, the existing world in itself is very problematic and structurally excluding them, right? So if you're going to speak at the UN as a Black woman, as a young woman, you will have to answer, are you married? That's what we have to answer to our US embassies before we go to CSW. And it means half of young women will never be able to access CSW, even though the issues being discussed should be informed by their daily lived realities. And so I think anti-Blackness and race plays a role in reinforcing exclusion, in terms of reinforcing hierarchies of patriarchy, of capitalism and neoliberalism and white supremacy. And in admitting that, we will be systematic and very categorical in terms of restructuring that. And then the other part is even when you manage to get at a professional level, and even if you're young, the truth is you probably will never be paid what you're worth. Because the assumption is if you're based in Nairobi, doing the same job as somebody based in New York, the assumption is the excuse of location, and then you will have to be forced to accept a lower pay because, well, I don't know, you're co-located in the global South and it's cheaper to live there. Well, shouldn't you be having or hired in the basis of your expertise? And so I think, and then being paid less means that your career trajectory will be based on inequality, and means you'll never catch up with your other colleagues in the same organization doing the same work. And so we'll be reinforces inequalities amongst individual women's lives, but also structural inequality by having that in anti-Blackness. So I think I'm very passionate about this. I don't want to go on further. And I'll also speak the issue about blacklisting that happens to Black women who are seen as difficult, as not playing into the hearts of the system. And so we know that there are so many women who will never be asked to speak because, well, they are too spicy, or they're not diplomatic. They don't articulate issues in palatable ways. And we don't live our lives in palatable ways. We live our lives in racist societies. So of course we are angry, right? And we express our anger using our words and articulating our outrage and articulating our analysis. And sometimes that's not always the easiest thing to hear if you're on the other side who's privileged, who's benefiting from the system. And so I think anti-Blackness, and racist structures have enabled this, and we must be able to create spaces for true dialogue, for true reconciliation, and also for just redistribution. I think for me, what would be the best thing in terms of discussing these tensions is creating two spaces of solidarity, right? I appreciate colleagues who share with me the true value of a role I'm applying for. You know, if you are honest about how much this role is paid and not pay me less because I'm paid in Nairobi, then I appreciate that, because most Black women will never find out their true worth because what they've been offered is really always below. Right. And that means they've been negotiating the next salary based on a lower salary already. And so I think there's different ways for us to unpack this. But I think for me, the most important one is how just being Black, international development foregrounds you in victimhood and continues to perpetuate a narrative that just grounds you at the bottom of the pyramid, and it's difficult really to find your way up. And when you do, it's really against so many odds. And so thank you so much, Lauren. Over.
No, thank you, Catherine, for all those truths. We have a few questions in the Q&A, and I know that we could keep discussing, we can keep going into this conversation for another hour or two, and I would love to just be in the same room as all of you to be doing that really right now. That would be fabulous. But we had a few questions come in through the just through the chat function, which came in early in the call. So I want to try to get to those. A lot of them are very linked. So I'll just send over two first. I wanted to thank everyone who did send in questions, but I want to address Priya's in the Q&A, which links to some of the ones we were sent in earlier, which is, appreciate this group of badass women. I agree, but I'm interested in how you all navigate as feminists across generations within your families and communities, which are meant to be safe spaces, but many times can be perilous and challenging. And to build on this, another question came in, which was, despite the differences you mentioned, it's clear we need to create a bridge so that all generations can agree on some essential elements in the struggle. So how can we create that bridge in which all generations feel comfortable and connected under a common cause? So can anyone speak to this?
Lauren, I would love to jump in terms of the safe family situation, because that is every South Asian woman's experience of being the difficult one, the outspoken one. I strongly relate to Priya, because what we do and what we learn is, in Tamil, we have a word called Bakkam. And in Sinhala, which is spoken in Sri Lanka, also there's a similar word, Lajja, which is shame. But it's a very gendered word, right? And it's used often on young women and girls. We're told so often in Tamil is Bakkamilla, which means, do you not have shame? And this happens when you speak out, when you push back, when you ask questions. And the first place so many of us learn that our voices don't matter, that we are difficult, that if we are, that the terms bossy, difficult, loud, are used on us, are used by our families, are used by the people who begin to train us, really condition us to be the women they think we need to be. And I think that's such a powerful moment and such a powerful place for us to start, because the first thing you have to learn as a young woman or a young girl is that, especially in South Asian culture, and I know this is true of other, many other cultures and African cultures, is that your family is supposed to be everything. And going against your family and pushing back against your family is such a violation of a cultural norm that is so deeply rooted in how you're raised. And that is such a hard thing. So that intergenerational trauma that keeps getting passed down, and then we do it to the next generation, and then they do it to the next generation, is possibly one of the toughest things to break, but something that's so important for us to be open and honest about and break.
Well, for me, it's been quite difficult because, as some of you may know, in Latin America and in Mexico, but in general in Latin America, we have a very machista society, right? And particularly, well, where I'm from, the north of Mexico, it's a really patriarchal and very machista. And so it's been tough, and I cannot say that it's been easy, because as we're seeing now, different feminist movements, protests, marches, and so on, we've also seen this massive backlash, especially from men, from machista men, reacting to this, to women advocating for their rights, and I've seen this with some colleagues, with some other activists that they've been the target of very nasty campaigns against them. And for me, I don't have the answer. What I would like to say is I just try to find my safe spaces. Yeah, sometimes it's difficult, and we always have this argument, right, with this discussion of, should I be a very outspoken feminist in my family environments or like friends environments, or should I just be quiet? Or I think as women, we're always having these internal discussions. But what I would like to say is that that's why it's really important to find safe spaces and safe networks, because that's how where we can nurture ourselves.
I think that within an African context, and specifically a Nigerian context, I think that the idea of feminism, the idea of challenging the norm or what is expected of you is very it can be frustrating within a family, right? So I think that even just personally, just like pressure to get married and be married and stay married is something. And, it always boils down to, it's because you went to school in the US, that's why you feel this way. Or, if you had stayed here longer, maybe you wouldn't have. But the thing is, I had always I think that it's interesting when you think about when did you become a feminist? When did you identify as a feminist for the first time? And I think that when I try to think back to that, it's interesting because I think that when I read Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Adichie in 2009, I had just left Nigeria again. And I think that was when I was started to get interested in what feminism is. The book wasn't really a feminist book, but I think it made me realize the different types of gender norms that exist within families, specifically Nigerian families, and how a lot of our traditional practices weren't as sexist or rooted in patriarchy, and how colonialism has played a big part in that. So I think for me, it's been a tough space to navigate. I don't think that I've come to the other side of it. I think that I'm definitely still trying to assert myself and assert what I believe in as well, right? So believing in abortion rights, and which is a huge taboo, especially as a Christian feminist, right? And that's a whole nother thing, right? Trying to explain to people, yes, I do identify as a Christian. I am also a feminist, and people kind of not being able to reconcile the two, but I can, and I will continue to. And I think that's been a tough space as well to navigate, especially considering how religious my family is and how religious my society is. So how religious the Nigerian context is as well. It's something that I've been struggling to navigate with. So I can't even say that I'm over that. I think that I'm still trying to navigate it, but still trying to not lose my voice and stick firm to what I believe in, because I believe that they are right and they are true and they are just. So I don't remember the second question that Lauren asked.
That's fine. I know we only have a minute left, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to the Q&A question. I will be sharing them with all of the panelists, so we will get back to you on that if you'd like to have a further conversation around it. So please don't worry, we have limited time, unfortunately, but one question just came through, and I think it might be a good way to wrap up the call today. But Susan sent over, I attended the UN Third World Conference on Women in Nairobi in 1985, and I think it is tragic we are having this conversation 36 years later. What key thing must happen so that women are not having this same conversation in 2057?
I can start on that. I think difficult conversations cannot be had in just one sitting, and I think they're evolving. And I also think that shows the ways in which things have evolved. I do believe that probably the same discussion was had in Nairobi before Beijing, but I also feel like right now the difference is we are speaking of a different world as well. We're speaking of different world orders. We're speaking of different mobs. The feminist organizing that we are responding to today is different from that of that time. So I think to truly have intersectional, cohesive, multi-generational cohesion and solidarity, which sounds like utopia, means that we do have to construct our sites for organizing as such, right? Construct our theories in unison, in intersectionality and true solidarity. I think for a long time, we know there are different feminisms, as Z has said, and I think that means that we all get caught up in our little idea of feminists. And feminists as women, we are quite difficult, we are very passionate, and we are fighting patriarchy. It's like a big elephant. We take the small bites, and before we finish the whole elephant, maybe another elephant has shown up. So I don't want to be simplistic in my answer. I just want to say that I don't think we will stop having the discussion. I think we should have them much more often, and we should have them much more often and with much more truth, and be open to listen to each other, right? Listen to each other with the different identities we bring, of race, of our gender identities, our social orientation, of our geographical locations, and all of that. I think it's not an easy discussion to have, but it's one that must be centered in all our work. Because for a long time, I think in the past few years, we know that the gender development work has been very depoliticized. And so it means that discourse itself has been really politicized, and we haven't had these political discussions because of, I don't know, professionalization, NGOization, many other issues that we didn't have control over. But now that we are finding spaces of solidarity, we are finding spaces of movement building, I think we should carve out those spaces and and hold them sacred outside of the politicized programmatic work, because we have to carve out that space or else it will never happen, is my point. And I think we really, I personally, as a younger feminist, I'm really grateful of the work done by feminists who came before us, because then I'm able to inherit quite sharp analysis on so many issues, right? And we can only build on that. But I feel like there has to be a very intentional way of doing the building. And because all of us have to be committed to the building for us to have a truly proud legacy for all of us. So I know it sounds like quite generic, my answer, but I also don't want to be simplistic in saying this is where it went wrong. I think there are so many things that went wrong, and not all of them were because of the feminist movement. The world just, I think life just happened is another way to put it.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks everyone. Thanks, Sharanya, Z, Alejandra. We will send out a survey to everyone who was able to attend this event, so that should be in your inboxes by tomorrow. We'd really appreciate if you could fill out the feedback form. It also gives us a way to get in touch with you if you do have any questions and you'd like to connect with us further. And please keep your eyes out. COFEM has a lot of great products and knowledge coming out in the next few months, starting with a feminist leadership learning brief next month. So please keep your eyes peeled for a launch of that and another conversation with members, followed by a handbook on feminist grant making and a feminist research report, along with more learning briefs. So please follow along on Twitter. We have all of our information there, and you can reach out to us on the website as well. And thanks everyone. This was so wonderful and so nice to see all of your faces. It feels really great to see you all. So thank you.
Lauren, for the amazing facilitation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone who joined too.